Los Angeles, and most of the Southern California, by talking about the traditional caretakers of this land. We are at UCLA, and hello to those of you who are joining us from Davis. And thank you to all of us, all of you who are joining us for this conversation about admissions rubrics, using rubrics in graduate admissions. This, as something you know, and certainly our presenters know, I'll introduce them in a moment. Rubrics are a key tool in holistic admissions, and this workshop is the second of 3 workshops that the Humanities Division at UCLA is presenting about holistic admissions. This workshop is sponsored by the Humanities Division and is presented by UDEB, which is the Alliance for Multi-Campus Inclusive Graduate Admissions. This is a Mellon-funded cross-campus initiative between UCLA, UC Davis, and USC to catalyze conversation and change around holistic admissions. So my name is Marissa Lopez. I'm professor of English and Chicano Studies and associate graduate team for diversity, inclusion, and admissions at UCLA. And joining me to talk about rubrics this afternoon is immediately to my right, Cristobal Silva, who is.
I'm going to interrupt you for a second. There's somebody's asking us to move the microphone closer because they can't hear.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Thanks for catching that. And the microphone is currently moving, and it will be close to me shortly. I'll just talk louder. Cristobal is an associate professor in the Department of English and editor of the 18th Century Theory and Interpretation. He is the author of Miraculous Life and Epidemiology of Early New England Narrative, and the author of the admissions rubric used by UCLA's English department. So whoever made that comment about the microphone, just let us know. Is that better? All right, let us know. Megha Sundara is professor and incoming chair, lucky Megha, incoming chair of Linguistics at UCLA, where she studies language acquisition in infants. She is the first author, most recently, of an article in the journal Cognition called Infants Developing Sensitivity to Native Language Phonotactics, a meta-analysis. And she was principal architect of the admissions rubric used in UCLA's linguistics department. And so with that, I will turn things over to Cristobal and Linda.
Thank you very much, Marissa, for introducing us. So, quick note, maybe we'll be sharing our slides now. Can we see them? Yeah. So we're going to start off by talking just a little bit about graduate admission, the role of rubrics in graduate admission, and why one might want to use them. First of all, we'll start us off, and then we will each talk about our individual experiences about implementing rubrics into the departments at Humanities at UCLA. So he'll talk about the Department of English, and I'll talk about the Department of Linguistics. And you're going to see that the overall process is the same, but the exact details differ because each department has its own way of doing things. And this is tailored. So just to give you a feel for how it works out when you actually try to implement it in a department. So Cristobal, all yours.
Thank you. Yeah, so if we can go on to the first slide. And I would just say that what Megha just said is one of the really important things that we've discussed and discovered in the last couple of years is that there's no like one size fits all rubric. They really do need to be tailored to by department, to size, specializations, things like that. And part of that is for the departments to think about what they want out of graduate admissions. So it's a long conversations. So the first step in the conversations that we've had is precisely this question: what is the purpose of an admissions rubric? And in highlighting that, we have sort of a couple of points. And one, and I think this was critical to some of our conversations in the English department and in the graduate committee of the English department, is that they're one of several tools to support the goal of holistic admission. So in other words, that the rubric isn't an end in and of itself, it is a tool. And the end for us, or the major part of the end, is the holistic admissions. And so when designing rubrics, we want to think really carefully about how that rubric can support those goals. And so, and Megha, if at any point you want to jump in with the slide, of course.
Sure, I can do that.
Okay. Second is, as part of those conversations, they help departments name the skills and attributes they value in graduate candidates. And so in designing the rubrics, I think that is one of the first questions we want to ask is, what are we looking for in graduate candidates? What do we want them to have, and what skills do we want to teach them along the process, or how do we want to train them along the process?
You can think of this kind of a conversation as a way to bridge the gap between more senior faculty and more junior faculty, some of whom have had more experience doing this kind of a thing for many, many years. Junior faculty were just coming in and are developing notions of what are the skills and attributes that the department believes is going to be most useful for these candidates. So you can also add that as a plus of having this conversation apart from having an admissions rubric.
I agree, and to add to that as well is it helps increase buy-in to the rubrics. So in other words, that rubrics aren't things that are just imposed externally, but there are things that are again built internally in the department according to those values. If we have those conversations, then we can build more rubrics that reflect our goals more closely. Third, and this is one of the key, my understanding, one of the key aspects of holistic admissions is they spread key decision points across a range of documents. So in other words, like for example, in English, where writing is so critical to what we do, it pushes the sort of thinking about writing and thinking about critical skills, not away from writing samples, but toward a bigger pool of documents, which will include the statement of purpose and the personal statement. Because as we know, writing samples change so much, not necessarily according to skill or potential, but really according to institution where someone has been taught, right? So if they're coming out of an Ivy League institution where they have very close mentorship with faculty who have access to all kinds of journals, that will be a different writing sample from someone who does not have that close relationship. But those differences don't indicate much about potential. And then finally, they help extend the pool of finalists beyond traditional metrics. And that, I think, for me, has been a really important key thing, right? That the rubric doesn't necessarily tell you that candidate X, Y, or Z needs to be admitted, but it takes a pool that we begin with in our traditional ways of doing admissions and increases it or extends it slightly so we can have those conversations and bring into the pool the candidates who don't have necessarily a prestige degree, or don't have necessarily the highest GPA, or don't necessarily have a publication records, which some students applying for graduate school increasingly now already have publications. So again, it's about extending the pool and keeping people in the conversation so that those conversations can develop into a holistic admissions process from year to year.
I mean, one thing to be aware of, though, is that it's not as if this is a linear process. So every year you use the admissions rubrics is not a year where you will have more a broader pool or a final list that is beyond the traditional metrics. It doesn't happen every year, but the hope is that gradually we are improving in a direction where we can include more and more, we can be more inclusive and mindful in the ways that we recruit graduate candidates.
Absolutely. So I think we can move to the next slide.
So we're going to talk a little bit about rubric development now, and the way we plan to do this is by talking about two case studies. So a case study in linguistics and how it came to be, and then Cristobal will talk about the case study in English. So if you're interested in more details, I have more details. I don't want to throw them all at you. Just email me and I'm happy to share. So you could have the next slide, please. Thank you. So I'll tell you a little bit about the linguistics admissions process, because as you will see, the development of the rubric and the way we can use it depends quite a lot on the way that admissions is implemented in each department. So to give you an idea, at UCLA Linguistics, we screen about 100, we get about 180 applicants year to year, 150 to 180, I will say. There is initially a screening by 2 people for fit. So the remaining applications, the ones who pass the criteria for fit, and this is mostly because based on whether we can support the research that the candidate wants to do in the department. So the rest of the candidates who make it through the first screening get assigned to 3 or 4 reviewers based on their research interests. So this is like conference reviewing, conference abstract reviewing. This is how we do the applications. So the admissions committee, there is one, and they get a larger review list. So an average faculty member who's not on an admissions committee can expect to see 3 to 4 applications, and the committee sees a lot more. The committee meets finally after getting all the reviews to arbitrate on their final list. And they submit that list, the recommended list, including the wait list, to the chair and DGS. And the chair and DGS will make the final admit and wait list based on funding considerations. So basically the job of the admissions committee is to draw a line somewhere and say, anybody above this is good. And then there are other decisions that need to be taken into consideration, as we all know, to figure out who we can actually financially support. Because we admit everyone, we do not admit anyone we cannot support. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So here's what we did. We implemented our, we developed and implemented our rubric rather quickly. So our first step was to gather sample rubrics from other departments. The one we found most useful was the one from anthropology, and that is what we adopted. But we sampled a whole bunch of others as well. So once we had the sample rubrics and we had narrowed it down to the anthropology one that seemed most amenable to be a starting point for our own rubric, I sat down with our chair and we adopted a draft rubric for use by linguistics. I mean, we made the obvious changes that we thought the department members, faculty members would like to see. And then we brought this draft rubric to a faculty meeting. It was a 2-hour faculty meeting, and basically our job was to develop a description for each category to be evaluated. And this was, as I said, a good venue for junior and senior faculty to exchange information about what is it we value and what do we think of as, and you will see that typically rubric evaluations are in 3 categories, high, mid, and low, to explicitly state how we describe a high score on any one of these criteria that we had narrowed down. We also spent a fair bit of time trying to figure out what part of the application material would be relevant to evaluate each of these criteria. And you will see that this is a big difference in terms of traditional evaluation of applications versus a holistic admissions approach. In a traditional evaluation, you evaluate the statement of purpose separately, the writing sample separately, the grade separately. So you have a ranking or a grading for each of these. At least that's how we used to do it. And this was a change because now you're evaluating people on criteria and using material and drawing on information throughout the application. The end of that faculty meeting, we made some ad hoc scoring guidelines, you will see, which were amended eventually. We did not make the use of the rubric mandatory. We encouraged the faculty to use the rubric with a view towards finding out A, if it was going to be useful, and B, finding out if in what ways it would fail or be different. I'm happy to report that we had a fair amount of buy-in. I think about half the faculty members in the department used it voluntarily. They were not all junior faculty. That is also something I will gladly share with you. A number of them were junior faculty, but some of them were also senior faculty. In fact, our senior faculty went so far as to evaluate application both ways. The traditional way they would do it, and using the rubric so that we had some data as to how this would compare, which was also very useful. At the end of the admission cycle, we had a debrief. Basically, we solicited feedback from all faculty members who used it about strengths and weaknesses of the approach and what they would like to see changed, which we subsequently implemented in the next year. So we've done this for 2 years. Okay. So that was our process in general. I will show you on the next slide that this is the main categories that we came up with to evaluate our graduate applicants are going to sound pretty familiar. I mean, we do this regardless of what kind of admissions process we use. Academic preparation broken into 2 parts, general prep, as well as specific prep in linguistics. Research potential, this is the one that got the most excited faculty discussions, because this is hard to put down in words how we assess or evaluate research potential. So it was a useful exercise to put that down. We had DEI contributions. we had fit to program, and then finally personal strengths. I've given you some examples of how we describe each what it means to have, say, a high score on research potential, or say a high score on personal strengths, just to give you a feel for the kinds of discussion and the kinds of topics that came up when we had this discussion. But of course, this is going to vary from, it's going to change from department to department. And finally, you will see at the last column suggested material. This was an exhaustive list, as in we were as inclusive as we could be, indicating that these are all the materials that an individual faculty member could consult to evaluate, or would consult to evaluate a candidate on any one of these criteria. So I'm going to now hand off to Cristobal, and he's going to explain how this worked out in English.
Okay, so yes, so the model of what the slides here, you'll notice are very close to the model of linguistics. And that's part in due to the fact that, as we'll talk about, the English department rubric was very much adapted from and in conversation with what linguistics did. So it feels strange to say that I authored a rubric. I was one of many, many voices to participate. I kind of feel like I came in the end and dotted a couple of I's and crossed T's. But I think it's important to emphasize that it's a collaborative process and an iterative process. And I guess Megha started to mention that, and we'll talk about here. So our departments are quite different, and so we have to structurally different. And so it's important again to shape rubrics according to how the department is, what the department is, and how it works. So we get so the last 2 years, we have many more applications than previous, or more applications than previous. We generally have, I believe, around 200 plus. COVID changed everything. So the last 2 years, we've had 300 to 400 applicants, which is a huge number. And so initially what happens is those the 300 to 400 are divided into 5 pools. Those are not by specialization. It's basically alphabetical. Each pool is assigned to a team of 2 readers from the graduate committee. So that means that the pools are going to have between 50 and 70 readers, basically. 50 and 70 applicants. So each team is going to read 50 to 70 applications in that first round. Using the admissions rubric, and this was particular to this past academic cycle, each team of readers is going to narrow their pool to 10 to 15 preferred dossiers. That will be, so typically readers will read each application individually, and then they will meet, compare their scores, and nominate, say, 10 to 15 dossiers for the next round. So the total of 50 to 75 dossiers go from round 1 to round 2, and there we have a subcommittee of 3 who then read all of the applications again in total, who look at the comments from round 1, and who look at the Megha scores, and so see how the strengths were identified. And then that subcommittee of 3 has a conversation that will build an admit list, a wait list, and a wait list based on round 1 reports, based on, as with linguistics, funding considerations, and this broader discussion of final pool. And so, in some years we'll have because of funding, a very limited number of people we can admit. So if we're talking, under 10 people for 400 applications, it's already a very difficult conversation to have. And so we keep those conversations open for as long as possible. And so finally, once that subcommittee of 3 has made its final lists, you'll report back to the grad committee for final approval, and then contact with the candidates themselves. So if I could have the next slide, please. And this is our development process, which took place over a couple of years. So the first thing we did, if I remember correctly, this is about when I came into the department, so I might miss the prehistory, was to poll faculty about qualities that help students navigate programs successfully. So what do we value? What do we think will help a student make it through the program? And so based on that, we drafted an initial rubric for trial, discussion, and review. And those are important discussions to have. They're not necessarily easy discussions to have, and there are a lot of questions, pushback, feedback, all of those things. And so after that process, then we gathered sample rubrics from other departments. And so this is especially linguistics. And we learned a lot from their process. And that's the thing I think that I really want to emphasize, based on their conversations, what they learned going through their iteration, their cycle, things that seemed to work for them and not. That gave us such a body of knowledge with which to move forward. So we revised, we simplified, and we adapted our draft rubric to address faculty concerns. So one of the key things that there was pushback against is that people were afraid that the use of the rubric was going to be really cumbersome, really hard. And I'm a little bit ambivalent about that. I actually don't think that it's that much more, but there are many things that we can do to make the use of the rubric easier. So we automated things, right? So that people didn't have to add up scores, the scores would add up for themselves. And I think that made things easier. We made very clearer categories, really clear guidelines, again, influenced by the linguistics department. So once we had this next draft, we discussed the draft rubric in grad committee. So there was more a conversation that we had in grad committee, which has about a dozen people in it, rather than in the entire department, which had between 40 and 50 people. I do think those are conversations that are important to have in the whole department, but this is structurally a different kind of conversation when you have so many more people in the meeting. So then we used this new rubric in this past cycle, 2021-22. And then after we used the rubric, we had a conversation. We reviewed the experiences, both pro and con, as well as the rubric, as well as reviewing what the rubric goals were after the admissions process. And there were things that people were surprised that they really liked about the rubric. There were things that there were pushback against, and all of those conversations are really important to have. I think it's important for people to feel like they've been heard in their frustrations. Sometimes those frustrations are frustrations shared a lot, and sometimes they're kind of things where we didn't necessarily communicate as best we could. Like I didn't communicate as best I could what the point of a specific category was. So to hear that feedback, we were able to diffuse some of the tensions. So now in process is currently analyzing the rubric data, right? So we have all these numbers across categories, and just want to think about what that tells us about the admissions process. That's a longer process that'll happen over the summer. And then the plans to revise rubric for 2022-23 admission cycle, to speak with the department and to speak with the new grad committee in the new year about moving forward and how to move forward. So that was our process. And if we go to the next slide, we'll have a familiar slide again, just a slightly different. I adapted it a little bit again, just to sort of show what we've done. So our categories, again, they're very much influenced by linguistics, but adapted to English. So our first category was research potential, which we categorized as a focus on the depth of the record. That is to say, whether students had research and work experience, whether they're able to articulate their scholarly interest, especially in the statement of purpose. And so that is actually going to, one of the things that's going to value is experience, right? Is that, and that is dependent on all kinds of access, which may not be distributed equally. But whereas that in certain years might have been the key category, it's just one, as you'll say, it's 1/5 of the total score we manage here. So you can, there's a maximum score of 10 on the high range there. Then the writing, which is a focus on clarity of writing, mechanics, and use of evidence to support analysis. And certainly the writing sample is important there, but we emphasize that the statement of purpose and personal statement are equally important, because in a statement of purpose, which might also be written in conjunction with faculty, we think, a much closer sense of the writer's voice. So that too is worth 10 points. And then academic preparation. So where the first was focused on depth of record, here we're calling it breadth of record. So, looking at the challenge, whether there's a challenging and diverse course of study. the evidence of intellectual curiosity, the multiple majors or changing majors and rising grades. So if someone has a low GPA, but their GPA was low in the first year or low in one particular year, but high and rising throughout, that's something that we believe is a key indicator of perseverance. A challenging course load across a broad range of departments, while it may lead to a lower GPA, also shows kind of an intellectual adventurousness and curiosity, which we value. So a change in major partway through, we have people who might start in the sciences and then transfer to literature halfway through. And that's an important change, and that will affect grades and records in all kinds of ways. But it's a thing that we want to have in conversation and think about how we value that in relation to GPA. So that also is worth 10 points in our rubric. And then what we call, and it's a term we're sort of struggling with, the non-cognitive attributes. Those include community involvement, public engagements, especially evidence of persistence or perseverance in accomplishing goals. And there we would look at personal statements, CV, and also letters of recommendation. Sometimes faculty do write to those questions or those issues in letters of recommendation. And so then also 10. So those first 4 categories are worth 10 points each. And the idea is that no one category is either disqualifying or will lead to a direct admission. Right? These are just the conversations. And then the last 2 are worth 5, the alignment to program. And this is actually, turns out to be a really important, we think in our conversations, is does the department, does this applicant fit what the department can do for them? Right? And you have that as that kind of the first reading that you do. It's an important conversation. And we think that's important in large part also for recruitment, because when we admit someone who has no fit, then it's very difficult, it turns out, to be recruiting them. So do we want to give a slot to someone who we anticipate will be very difficult to recruit for that specific reason? And there are other difficult recruiting questions, but that's what we need to address. And then last category, what we're calling contributions to diversity. And this was the category that there had some perspective. What does diversity look like? What does diversity include or exclude? And we tried, in fact, with this category, not to presuppose what diversity looks like in the application. So we are looking for evidence to overcoming barriers to higher education. That might be distance travel, that might be work. All of these things, if they appear, we can try to sort of quantify those. Students who attend minority serving institutions, students who have a record of academic service to underrepresented students or communities. That we think is an important thing as well, and shows that outward-facing, public-facing drive that is important to University of California. And then finally, also their research interests. Do research interests engage with issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion? Those don't, again, qualify or disqualify a student, but we do note it when a student has in their entire record has no mention of these questions at all, versus students who do and who do show commitment, versus students who, and this is a little trickier, who feel like they ought to write something about that, but don't have the record of actually demonstrating that it's a true commitment. So this is what we're trying to capture here. We get a total score out of 50, which again is not yes or no, you're admitted or not admitted, but what serves as the conversation starter in the narrowing of the fields. So that's what we do in English, and we're happy to, I guess, have questions and things like that. But the last thing I'll say is something that Megha said before, is that the key thing to this is that's an iterative process. Every year we keep having a conversation, thinking about how we might what we're using the rubric for, how we might change it or improve it for the future, what worked, what didn't work. And always when there are scores, there are going to be things that were unpredictable in the scoring. And so we want to think about what those mean to us moving forward.
I'll add 2 things to that. And one is, one of the key questions that I think every department will have to consider is, for instance, the proportion of international students they admit. Okay. And I bring that up only to highlight that applications look very different when they're from international students versus domestic students. And one place where they look very different is in contributions to diversity. Because while this is a conversation that has come into the main room in the US, this is not the case in most other places. So when international applicants apply to us, they don't even know that they are being evaluated on this criteria in a way. So this is a discussion that you will want to have in each of your departments as to how you can encourage or credit students who show an engagement with diversity while not dinging people who are, say, international applicants who just have no idea that they were going to be evaluated on this. So in a way, you cannot run this kind of a holistic admissions process without, I guess, explicating your admission criteria. And maybe one way you can do that is to have some information on your department website indicating the kinds of ways or dimensions or criteria on which we're going to evaluate incoming applicants. So the bottom line is you want to be as explicit as you can possibly be about what matters, what makes a successful graduate student applicant and an application, such that you can level the playing field in a way. So that is something that you want to consider. Second thing I will bring up is we also have a score. I didn't talk about it, but we also have a score. But what our faculty found most useful after our first round of using the rubric is that the score was okay and useful, but the more important things, particularly in the discussions, was the detailed comments that each reviewer put into their graduate applications. And we can all agree that you cannot reduce people to numbers. So when we are discussing the bigger pool, this does not, having a rubric will never be an alternative to having a detailed, nuanced commentary on the application file, because whoever is making the decision is likely not read all the files. This is just the way it works. If you have 180 applications or you have 200 or 400 applications and 3 people making a decision, nobody's reading every file and nobody can remember all of this. So having that kind of detailed feedback is also very useful for whoever is making the decisions in your department about who to admit or not.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Oh, so much. So inspiring and heartening to hear you talk about the journeys in your own departments. And I want to say for our Zoom participants, if you have questions, please put them in the chat. We have 2 people looking at the chat, so they'll let us know as questions pop up. And I'll first just ask if anybody here has any questions to start. I certainly have tons of questions.
I'm just wondering how you consider, so obviously, as with many departments, we have the issue of the difficulty of funding international students.
Correct.
So how you offset that where all other things being equal, the international student might be the preferred candidate, but all things are not equal in terms of needing to support someone that will be more difficult to support.
I mean, so this is in some way not the problem of the admissions committee, but the problem of the chair and the DGS in our department. So the admissions committee makes a wish list of all the candidates who it would be amazing to have with some kind of ranking, relative ranking. So it's not absolute. In fact, up to a certain point, we don't relatively rank people at all because, hey, anyone would be just fine. So the decision for how many international students we can take is, sadly enough, a completely financial one.
Mm-hmm.
It is going to vary from year to year. And that is really what we do. This is why the chair is the one who doesn't sleep at night.
Lucky you
And so,
next year.
yes, so as I said, right now that's not me, so I'm sleeping well. That's some point will be me, and I will be sleeping well. But you are completely correct. The deserving candidates, being a deserving candidate alone doesn't get you admission. There has to be, unfortunately, a financial consideration.
And I would say it's probably, I'm going to be careful what I say because I'm not super in tune with the exact mechanics. But I think in English we have a very similar issue where we're limited in the number of international candidates we can admit, and we're not talking about 3 or 4 international candidates, especially when we're admitting a class of 6, 7, or 8. We may it's 0, 1, or maybe 2. And it's true that they're absolutely fantastic. And we tend to, I think to sort of speak to something you had mentioned, is I think we kind of have them in a slightly, it's not a different pool, but the international candidates are kind of first ranked or measured in relation to each other.
Yeah.
This is simultaneously, it's not first, to each other and to the domestic pool as well. But it absolutely becomes down to a funding question at the end of the day.
I mean, you have the alternative to go just by your criteria and take the top X if you choose not to fund everyone 100%.
Yeah.
That creates a different kind of inequity and in a way more heartache for the individual as well, because they now have to come live here in Los Angeles. It is not cheap. And that's just also awful. So a long time ago, that is what we used to do. Each person had their own individual funding package and we didn't guarantee anybody funding. This was a long, long time ago. It just created more sadness, and the department decided as a whole that that is not a model we're willing to go with, which means now you have the discussion of financial considerations upfront. So it's whatever works for the department.
I think we're finding, like, in terms of funding, one of the things we found this year is it's becoming, in fact, it's like a funding arms race. So we found that some of our, sort of the peer competitors, especially in private institutions, whether on the East Coast or West Coast, are able to offer packages that, are like 25% higher than ours or something like that, right? And that's a big thing that we're facing. Now we're still managing, this is one of the things about the University of California, is we're still managing to recruit some amazing students and recruit them against top private institutions as well. But the funding is absolutely an issue. I think we have the same commitment. It's an important commitment to funding.
In practical terms, then diversifying your admit list actually helps because you're not all fighting for the same 5 candidates across universities in an arms race. So you are identifying, and as a public university, this is what we do. We find promising people who other people don't see potential in so that we can get them and see stars. That's what it is. I mean, is that not the whole mandate of being a public institution? As far as I'm concerned, it is.
Well, I think the fact that we are a public institution and we have that mandate and that is explicit in so many ways, it's manifest in so many ways, that does help us recruit even the candidates who are being recruited.
But I'm not against recruiting a candidate that everybody thinks is amazing. That's great. But we can't just be fighting for those guys because our pockets just are not deep enough. And they will never be.
So I'm interested in hearing both of you talk about, we heard you talk about the process that your departments went through, and it's not easy, it's laborious, it takes time, it takes commitment. So why? and how do you narrate this to your colleagues? Like, why are we doing this? And how do you explain the why to your colleagues?
I mean, I can tell you what I said, which was apparently incorrect, but not exactly accurate, but it worked. So my understanding was that developing a rubric was not an option. It was either going to be given to you at some point, at some nebulous future point, or we could have a say at this point in how we adapt it to our department. When faced with those choices, most sensible departments will pick, hey, maybe grudgingly, we will make our own because we ourselves understand the ethos of our department, what we value, and that is probably the best way to do it. Now, Dean Scarper tells me that that is not an accurate statement about the state of affairs, and maybe we would have never been forced to use some generic cookie cutter rubric, but that was my understanding at that point. So I didn't misrepresent the position deliberately, but it appears that I did do that. That was my way of getting buy-in, and we got buy-in. And now it's too late.
I think there's similar things. I'll say, like, my personal experience, and maybe other people have something similar, is that I've been at several different kinds of institutions, public institutions, private institutions, small regional.
Pause you for 1 second. Are we muted right now? No, okay.
Small regional,
Not
and flagship institutions. And throughout, graduate admissions is basically done the same way. And one of the things that's always frustrated me about that is you get at some point just going on a gut feeling. And I don't like that gut feeling down on one thing. Like, we just know that that's, and you know what, I don't think it's people acting in bad faith. It's just not helpful for equity, diversity, and inclusion. And for me, the rubric is a way, I mean, we're still sort of kind of, there's an art to it, obviously, there's a bit of gut feeling, but it's kind of a way to distribute that away from one central thought to a bigger picture. That I really love. I think in relation to what Megha was saying is that there is perhaps a fear in colleagues sometimes that this is something being imposed, a bunch of slips here, externally on them, things that you must do, and that don't necessarily make sense. The one thing I'll say, I keep saying about the rubric, is I think that, and maybe your data will reveal this, you mentioned that you have colleagues who did it both ways, is I suspect that 85% of the people who make it into your next pool are going to be the same, regardless of whether you do rubric or not. And so those are fine. We're happy with those 85%. But it's the other 15 or 10, maybe even 5% that's really key. Those are the people we're targeting to keep in the pool in order to have that conversation. The rubric is not going to tell you admit them or don't admit them. The rubric is going to tell you, let's have a conversation about what we value. And that to me is the thing I really like about them, about rubrics, and the thing I want to emphasize. And just to kind of, I'm not going to reveal any sort of bad data or specific things, but an example from this year is we had 2 candidates who had the same rubric score. One was Ivy, in fact, published a candidate, great candidate who has all the polish, and one is unpublished, smaller local school, but who did a lot of interesting work. In a traditional version, we would have immediately run to the published because, okay, we know that they're going to be successful, and kind of let the other person slide to the side. This is regardless, by the way, of any demographic information. This is just about the candidates themselves. But what we found in the rubrics is that 2 different teams scored them, and they had received the same score. And that to me is what the rubric should achieve, right? Different ways of cataloging them, of reviewing them, brings you to the same score, and then you have the conversation. Would we like candidate A? Would we like candidate B? Or both A and B, or neither A and B? And for what reasons? To me, those conversations are always worth having, especially as we move forward, imagining what we want for the future of the profession.
Like I said, I have lots of questions. We're coming up on time, but I have 2 that I want to make sure I ask them unless anybody here wants to jump in. One is a granular question. So Cristobal, the English rubric says research potential / work experience. And so I'm curious to hear you talk about how you've seen that play out, how you think about work experience in relation to research or research potential. And Megha, your linguistics rubric talks about research potential, but I'm wondering if you as a department think about work experience too.
I mean, I can answer first because it's straightforward, typically not.
Okay.
So we could, but we rarely get candidates from, say, industry or other work experience coming in. So I think it's just a matter of coincidence that we have not yet hit applicants of that sort. And so we have not had an explicit discussion of how to integrate information you get about that into our evaluation. So it's a pretty straightforward answer for us because they're not in our pool.
So I'm not sure if I'm answering the right question, but one of the things that the categories that we're thinking about, like besides the top line kind of title of the category, is the sort of breadth versus depth of knowledge. So that in terms of that preparation question, right? So the breadth does it, like people who do the specific research. So in our field, right? They do maybe have fellowships, summer fellowships, or studies abroad. Again, those are all like the traditional things which should not be discounted. right? So they are important, so we think about those. And then, but we want to balance them against other. When you say work experience, did you mean academic or like people who are actually working full-time?
Well, the hour rubric. It says there was a line item there, so research potential / work experience.
Oh, right,
so
right.
How?
Yeah. So we're just sort of looking for, that's exactly it. That might be, also people who work as research assistants or right. So the kind of in the work that might indicate field specific, right, or discipline specific preparation. Again, it's like a one kind of thing, but someone who switched majors halfway through might not have that kind of experience, which is why we want to balance it against others. The one place where I am really thinking through is how to measure, how to talk about students with masters versus students without a master's, because research experience is going to be very different there. And while we want to value either one group of candidates, we don't necessarily want to measure them against each other, because that's going to create a whole other set of, I guess, what the technical term is inefficiencies that are going to distort the way the tools.
Actually, Marissa, I'm going to add to my answer. I was not completely, I think, here's a situation where we did consider work experience. And I'm talking about work experience not relevant to linguistics in the sense, just general work experience. And we actually considered it under personal strengths. So one of our candidates, for example, who had been a middle school teacher, which we thought was a huge testament to this person's personal strength, because we all know that being a middle school teacher requires the stomach and many other admirable qualities which we thought were commendable and would serve a graduate candidate amazingly. So we do consider it in that. So if it's not directly applicable to linguistics, then we consider it under personal strength.
When you were talking about the rubric, Cristobal, you talked about research experience as one of those gray areas, because that depends on access and resources. So what I was thinking, it reminded me of a conversation I had with a colleague once about, I said something about how research experience opens up the potential for implicit bias, and the sources said no, either they have it or they don't. I said, well, if we also have to think about why they don't have it, right? Because sometimes these research experiences are unpaid, and so differently resourced students have to work or have to do other things. So I thought that's where we're going with that. But I think they're all also interesting.
Yeah, and that's true. But and I think that's why, again, we're trying to spread these categories, spread a number of categories again, to be able to value the things which undeniably are really strong preparations, but aren't indicative of necessarily a successful complete. We all know an experience, right? Like I talk about this all the time. When I was in grad school, people much smarter than me never finished. That had nothing to do with intelligence, nothing to do. It's just, it has to do with your desire, I suppose, to either live through that experience or not live through that experience of graduates. And those are hard to
euphemistic put. Yes.
So at the last of these sessions, we talked a bit about how it seems, so I'll speak particularly about now that it's increasingly not the case that we get students without MAs. I went into my PhD program without an MA, and I don't think I would be accepted now to that program without the MA. Generally, would you say that most of your applicants are coming in with MAs, and has that been something that the rubrics might have helped consider more holistically? I suppose maybe not necessarily empirically shifted, but just, as you said, considering students who aren't coming in with necessarily the MA, which can be exclusionary and prohibitive, as many aren't funded.
Interestingly enough, I would say most of our international students come with MAs, but not our domestic ones. That's my gut feeling. I should probably not just say that and look up numbers, but that's my feeling. How would the rubrics have changed that? I don't know, actually. I would have to think about this more carefully. Because, for some criteria, if you have an MA, your CV is just longer, which means that you have more room to have demonstrated some of the obvious things. Academic preparation, for example, academic preparation specific linguistics, or research potential, all of these things now, you've just had more time to demonstrate it. So this is correct. So I don't think using the rubrics would actually even the playing field there based on that. But it just has not happened for us. And I'm sure it's something that's waiting to happen. This is the creep. You just want more and more people to show more and more promise, but not promise, but evidence of success before they come in than taking them on promise. And we are all guilty of that somewhere. So
I'm thinking, you said something there that is ringing a bell, and I'm thinking, I'd have to confirm this as well, that absolutely we probably have a similar experience where international students who are applying tend to have more of the masters. That I think we have the same experience. You know, it's hard for me to speak about this year in particular because it really is for all kinds of reasons a difficult year in where again we're getting 300 plus applications for 6 slots. So what we can deduce numerically out of that, statistically significant, is very little. So we did have a number of master students with masters. I think most of our students who admitted don't have masters. Last year, I think it was different. We had a bigger class and we had more students with masters. So I haven't yet digested that data to really, I don't even know how to digest that data. Actually, I'm sort of still asking the questions to figure out what are the right questions to get the answer. But it is definitely something to be very
We have about a minute left. So in 30 seconds or less, here's a real top level question. For departments who are just embarking on this magical journey to developing a rubric, can you each come up with 1 or 2 definite do's and 1 definite don't? Like a hot pro tip and a hot con tip.
get the chair behind you.
That's a good one.
Without the chair, it's not going to happen.
I would say, you know, have those conversations, have open conversations about what it is that you value, and then get advice, examples from other departments and what they did. So you don't have to reinvent the wheel every time, because that can be frustrating. And get the chair to part, and then don't, and I guess a don't is, I guess.
Don't do all the work because you think you're helping, but you're not helping, because unless people buy in and contribute to the discussion, they won't use it.
That's the buy-in, is put it right, is don't forget to put the buy-in as the first thing. That's exactly it.
Because if you do the work, it's not. It is seen more as your idea that you're imposing on everyone, and it's gonna not be taken well. Because we are all cats. This is true. Being an academic is being a herd of cats. It's like, this is what we are. We don't like other people's ideas that much. Only our own.
Even when they like them, we don't.
Exactly.
I kind of like that as a way to close out. We're all cats and we don't like other people's ideas.
Exactly.
But do we want to close on anything slightly more positive?
Cats are amazing creatures.
Cats are amazing creatures. Everyone, you heard it here in
Exactly.
UCLA. Thanks to those of you in the room who joined us, and thank you to everyone on Zoom. We really appreciate your being here. And thank you to our presenters.
Thank you.